Nous sommes
We're delighted to welcome Tristan Garcia is a writer and a philosopher, teaching philosophy at the University of Lyon 3, a prolific author. He published many works on philosophy and on literature. He would like to be distant and to keep the two domains apart, but you've got connections between philosophy and history. In terms of philosophy, some books are well known. Nous, La Vie Intense, Nous, Animaux Humains, but it's a treaty which he published in 2011 that made him known in his first part of ontology. He would like to look at the world and what it contains in an equal way, in a less hierarchical way, not from a human standpoint. In Forme and objet, he's trying to examine everything as is and why, to give it something opportunity. The philosophy of Tristan Garcia can be contemplated at a time of Forme and objet in a movement starting in the end of the 2010s, speculative realism, where realism means the real embraces not only what is present physically, what you can see right away, but not what it was in the past, but what could be, what is possible. This orientation to the possible, where you open up the potential of everything, is directed to many objects, be they artistic and philosophically. He wrote a lot of articles on Pierre, and with his interest for the possible, not astounding that in your work as a writer you wrote sci-fi, like Les Cordelettes de Browser, written in 2014, Le temps c'est comme arrêter et ne progresse plus. Other novels such as Romancette, which got a prize, a collection of novels, which is a kind of sci-fi, because although most of the novels set a stage, they have very different sites. Mixing realism and science fiction would lead the writer to a new world, moving world, with the title you proposed for your statement, The Invention of the Future. We're impatient to listen to you, Tristan, on the way in which the possible can be built up or designed. Thank you, Florence. Well, this afternoon, not to spread myself too thin, let me look into an inquiry, a two-part inquiry. What sci-fi, in a narrow sense of the word, so-called, in the 20th century, in a certain European tradition, which is Germanic, French, British, Italian, or in a broader sense, a form of representation of the future based upon speculation from scientific research, trying to, it's a survey we're doing to understand what sci-fi in the broader sense is, what is not, what it is not, and what it could do, what it could be. To try to understand what it is not, let me go back from what people say who don't read sci-fi normally, which in sci-fi basically a kind of irrational, technicized form backed upon scientific progress, a kind of prediction, prophecy, or if you forget the word prophecy, a prediction, a forecast. In the first part of my talk, I'd like to try to understand together why it's the wrong track to take, covering what Louvain said, designing sci-fi as a kind of literary representation, not only. You've got sci-fi illustration Why is it the wrong track to think that sci-fi in its narrowest sense, or in a broader sense? Why sci-fi is not prediction or forecast, rationalized prediction based on scientific knowledge. In the first step, let me try to use the text, which is unknown, forgotten, which was a very important text before World War I, which you might have heard of. You never saw it, possibly translated into French, very badly translated anyway. The title is totally wrong, totally off. But anyway, a text from H.G. Wells, a Time Machine, or Invisible Man, or Form of Things to Come, which is published in 1913, translated into French by the liberating destruction, the world set free in English. Wells, let's look at a paradox. Wells presents his text as you hear sci-fi to be presented as a kind of prediction or forecast of the future. After the first chapter, telling the story of the humanity, origins of man going back to time immemorial, the whole book is an attempt to explain, to tell about the 20th century in 200 pages. It tells about the 20th century, which did not really, finished. He wrote before World War I. Paradoxically, it's a text which was quite successful just before the World War I. It was totally forgotten, which is one of the texts which is not really well known, whereas it is its most exact text. Based on his own criteria, Wells was a socialist who was very committed, a scientist who wrote Darwin, read Marx, who thought that sci-fi was a tool to explore the future, to predict the future, to forecast the collapse of Europe and the emergence of a socialist utopian society. Paradoxically, if you talk about prediction, it's the right prediction. Destruction, the world set free is able to contemplate things which will come to pass in the 20th century. Unlike The Invisible Man, for example, which is a narrative, which is a canonical in sci-fi, and not something which is not there yet, which did not come to pass, making oneself invisible, or The Isle of Dr. Tomorrow, addressing genetic manipulation, the world set free, announces the future. Let me try to understand what we're going to call first a paradox of any prophecy. If you bring sci-fi to a prophecy, successful prophecy, is canceled out as prophecy. If you understand by sci-fi a kind of prediction, sci-fi is a bad, realistic novel. Namely, once it's a matter of telling the facts, the reality, once sci-fi is caught up by time, it is quite disappointing. The world, he's a genius, but it's quite boring because, let me read a history book. It would be better as a realistic novel. The problem is that the paradox is that if sci-fi is a prophecy is canceled out when it comes to pass. There's no admiration for his genius, which is evaporating because it is caught up by reality. That's the case. That's quite interesting. Not fully of the book. The Wells book is visible because it's a failure, not a success. It's a mixture of failure and success in the prediction. Now let me give you an aspect of the book in a few minutes to explain what is the share of sci-fi in the book and why sci-fi is not successful, which was Wells aiming for, which in the postface and postscript is quite disappointed by the chapters because he described something which did not come to pass. I'm quite proud of what he predicted. The book is a story of humanity which resonates with the present because it's a history of humanity, which is a predator species from time immemorial. These narratives were quite fashionable. namely the idea according to which human species has a flaw. Wells, who reads a lot of anthropology, imagine that the man is fragile when he is born, from the womb. When he's born, man has a flaw. He must invent his own nature because he's weak. He has no shell. He must. He's got to create weapons because he's got no claws. The human nature is not to have any nature, missing, lacking nature. You got to build your own nature, and this nature is culture. Culture is the nature which a man must build himself. From this idea, man is a weak being having energy. He must extract energy from nature. It talks about energies, fossil energy, fossil fuels, extraction of fossil fuels. He shows humanity as a kind of predator species. Humanity is a kind of predator trying to capture nature, forms of energy outside of him and internalize them in particular. He's got great pages on this. He's projecting into the psychology of the prehistoric man who is jealous of sun, which is a form of energy. He would like to own the sun, this idea by which man is weak in capturing the forces of nature like fossil fuels, but also wind, light, and sun, results in the fact that modern men will try to extract energy from nature and from the sun. At the bottom of the matter, which is nuclear energy, Wells just read the first physicist starting to get interested in this, who will read Wells' book themselves. He's reading science, and the scientists will read Wells' books, which is quite successful among scientists just before World War I. Wells is the first to imagine forms of nuclear energies. The nuclear energy might result in the atom bomb. Humanity will get into a warlike phase in 1956, he says. Quite interesting, because by condensation, like Freud, is condensed to World War I into two, the last war, not the first, where there's no Second World War. It is the last war. The last war dates from 1956 to 1970, resulting in devastation of Earth, which is ecological in nature, related to the discovery of atom energy, the repurposing of energy to industrial uses, the appearance of the H-bomb, and he's got very seizing pictures. He represents what he talks the catastrophe, the disaster, which is the explosion of atom bombs producing great image explosions. These are bombs which do not explode instantly. They will not cease exploding for years. He's got an insight into radioactivity. In some pages, he'll describe Hiroshima and Chernobyl. The atom bomb plus territories which are irradiated for scores of years, which are where you have a kind of a red flare exploding, never cease exploding for tens of years, making life unlivable. And nature is so hostile that men have to go away elsewhere. He will also imagine strange things after the war in the 70s, what he's going to call another culture, an alternative culture, where peace will come in new generations, other kinds of cultures, music. He's using the autobiography of Barrett. It is Barrett, which will go on the road and travel to go to Delhi. There's a lot of effects, quite impressive, because you feel that in 1913, Wells has a kind of insight based on his scientific readings of what will be the 20th century. But, however, yet from one to the next, it's quite disturbing. You read somebody who imagining all this while just being on the cusp of the 20th century. Moving out of the 20th century, we read in the past the projection by someone before he gets into the 20th century. This projection is successful and a failure. Successful and failed because, as I said, what Wells was proud of is at times where it is a long passage in which he imagines a convention where nations in Europe trying to gerrymander, trying to he talks about the Congress of Vienna in 1815, but anticipates the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. It would be better described in a history book. So the problem of Wells' book, with the translation, which is destruction, there's a sci-fi book in a way which is quite narrow, a scientist book, where characters do not really play a role. Wells is using a strange technique, producing a separation, detachment. It's very cinematographic, whereas he never went to the cinema. He's oming in. He will propose the war, nuclear bombs, environmental problems, and he will decide suddenly to home in on one character who's going to use for 4 pages, a scientist, a stenotypist. He's going to look into the rights of women, and also he's moving away from this character, lost in this landscape. It's quite disturbing. You're moving from novel to a kind of historicizing fiction. You're a bit lost at times when you read the book. When you close the book, you have at least 3 impressions. First is an impression of vanity. Vanity, namely, you feel that Wells succeeded. In 1913, what a lot of sci-fi authors wanted to do, use sci-fi as a way to anticipate social, historically, futurology, basically. Indeed, when he succeeded, it's useless because it came to pass. Why read it? No use. Second impression of interest. 20th century describes not our century. It's producing a possible, a likely 20th century, which is quite strange, having 1 foot in fiction, 1 foot in history. This 20th century is more interesting than what it described beforehand. You can compare between what we heard between the fears of Wells, which are fears which are British. He's got nationalist fears, for example. He's trying to imagine the national languages. And as a Brit, English is becoming the lingua franca. He's trying to imagine a time where there's a linguistic revolt against the hegemony of English. He's interested in Volapük Esperanto, in a worldwide language. The way he imagines the language seems to contain a description for us as readers of the web, but he's not describing its material structure, but the spirit thereof. When he describes the spirit of the language, he seems to describe the spirit of what is quite materialistic to us in national space for change in communications, based on modes of communication you cannot anticipate. The second feeling is as follows. The interest is due to failure and success from comparing 2 20th centuries, a real one and actually an impossible one, an imaginary century based on the fears, the hopes of Wells, who's a socialist. He's a utopian socialist in 1913. The book, that's why it's called The World Set Free, after having been very somber and very dark. There's a catastrophe. Life became impossible on Earth. Men just respond, and they wake up and produce a society without nation, without work. Well, they will use energy, nuclear energy, which is not warlike, which is peaceful. There's a third feeling or impression emerging from the book, feeling which is strange. In the book, there's a kind of appeal to the reader in the last pages where you have a last man called Quadrige, kind of philosopher, thinking about what humanity could become at the 20th century. It's a kind of appeal, it's a kind of address to the reader who, like Wells, is at the start of the century, to a reader who will be in the 21st century. This appeal to set up a kind of community through centuries of writers who would try at the turn of the century to produce a history of what the century could be or should be, and would form a kind of community where you could compare the fears of humanity, the dreams from one century to another, what could be the century and what it was actually. It is a kind of idea of not only of an historic progress, but a meta-progress by which you would not compare what cycles could be, but you would compare what we believe the cycles to be, what they were, to try to relate them to our own dreams, our own nightmares, our own way to anticipate the next century, to try and modulate, temper it, compare it to the failure or success of Wells in his own anticipation of the cycle, which is now past. That's how the book ends. It's a book which was forgotten, which is of no interest, which became a book from the past. Now let's go back to try and understand why the failure and the success of Wells' book should indicate to us that Wells is wrong in believing that sci-fi is just prediction. In other words, sci-fi is prediction, forecasting, but it can only be prediction. Why? Because basically, in introduction to the book, what does he do? He's identifying sci-fi as a way to introduce, he says, the future in reality, trying to look for the future, trying to put him into reality, to incorporate into reality. The term which is missing is the term of possible. In a second moment of inquiry, let's introduce the possible to try to understand what is missing, what is lacking in the book, so it does not, pay tribute to sci-fi, because what could be sci-fi? Let me now go backtrack in time from 1913 to the origins of sci-fi in Europe. What happened in the 18th century? It is not called sci-fi at the time, but anticipation, social anticipation, utopia, extraordinary travels, producing fictional narratives through which authors in Europe, French, German, Germanic states, Italy, English, are trying to do what? They're trying to project the possible outside the present. That's what Sébastien Massier does, describing the year 2040 in every European country, including the Slavic country and Russia. There's a lot of anonymous authors describing the year 2000, the year 4000. Why do you have all these narratives? For a simple reason, it's a matter of censorship. After Mercier in most of the European states, before the French Revolution, issues of censorship make it very hard to criticize French monarchy, or for other authors in Europe, criticizing religion, criticizing the princes. It's become hard to criticize the state. Mercier will open the door in which scores of text will get through in the year 1780, moving the possible criticism into the future, describing European states, describing imaginary states, or describing a state of their own country in the coming years, not to be censored. What happened? Let's try to understand why in the 18th century, metaphysicists, writers, poets will project possibilities, social possibilities, new forms of humanity into the future. That's what we call the invention of the future in the Enlightenment, a certain type of future. Why is it important as the place where you can project the possible? It's interesting to think that if the writers will start to project into the future possibilities, fictional possibilities, it's because other places, other forms of locations are shut. They're of two orders. Before the 18th century in cultures in Europe, first form is the myth. The myth, we know, consists in projecting possibility, narratives before time, before the origins of the world, to explain the way in which man was formed, to explain how gods, it appeared by happenstance, by accident, because God made a mistake when describing possibilities, by moving him, by describing a world just before time and the origin of time, describing it, projecting possibilities in the past. The myth is the projection of possibilities, be they anthropological, narrative, combining genders, sexes, species. Why is man different from other species? And in the myth, everything is before the possibility precedes the actuality. The reality would describe a state, a status of species, of genders, of cosmos, which is possible, moved before now. The first place of projection of the possible is before, namely the myth. The second place is space. In unknown territories, you project the possible into utopias. Like Thomas More, when you map utopias, you realize that the way in which humanism Europe will produce utopias is quite simple. It's a map of the borders, frontiers. All the utopias will come closer to Antarctica. It's happening in Antarctica. Marivaux is writing a utopia with an island of penguins because you did not yet map the Antarctica. Utopias are always located just beyond the known territories. And the first, in Thomas More, utopia, when the character hears about utopia, which is localized with a kind of artificial narrative, where is the utopia located? He is cuffing. We don't exactly where utopia is located. It is not a non-place. It is possible, projected beyond known locations. Now, the more you progress, the more Europe is becoming imperialistic and mapping the rest of the world. The white places are being reduced between the 16th and 18th century. You have a kind of melting of the white colors. It's quite hard for others to produce extraordinary travels, projecting possibilities, social, anthropological, narrative, beyond the unknown places. The unknown places are being reduced, and at the end, there will remain this white space, Antarctica or Arctic. This place is to be found in Allan Poe. At the end, it's a kind of white space. Poe was attracted by a theory at the time. He wrote about the hollow. There was a hole, a vortex. All the currents, the Gulf streams, are explained by a kind of siphon. There was a last unknown territory in the world, the poles, which made possible to get into the Earth. Once the explorations mapped the territories around the north and south, all these territories disappeared. What will happen in sci-fi when Earth will be mapped totally by cartographers, where you're going to project in space possibles, namely outside space and outer space. The narratives of space conquest, Mars, when the Earth is mapped totally. And now you've got two projective spaces of the possibly for the 18th century, before, the myth in the past, or elsewhere. Utopia elsewhere is reduced on Earth, before will be rejected by all the philosophers of stories, which will build the idea of historicity against the myth. in Condorcet and Voltaire. History is what's opposed to the myth. The myth will be okay for the primitive people in historicity, with the fact of sequencing facts, going back to the origins, rationally setting up fact, a succession of facts. That's where you will invent between 1870 and 1780 in British philosophers like Ferguson, Miller, in the French like Condorcet, Voltaire, theorizing history, inventing the future as a projecting place of the possible. You don't project the possible elsewhere, not possible onto the before. You project into the future, which is quite specific. You got a term in Condorcet, which is quite right. In a note, he's trying to summarize in tables. He's the first who is putting up tables as a trope in sci-fi of the age of merchants, the age of heroes. Heroes are like in Asimov's Foundation. You've got the age of heroes, and you got the age of traders, of merchants. Noble virtues are lost, but you got rationalization of society, the age of scientists. All this is found in Condorcet, setting up tables trying to rationalize periods and epochs of time. Condorcet does not stop at the present. He's continuing into the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century. And he's got an expression who says, by doing so, I'm not doing the history of the future, but of the past. It is exactly what he invented by the Enlightenment is a kind of idea of the future as something which is not yet past, which will become past. Past is that you can tell it. Sci-fi would be simply what you can project into the past, but you're trying to guess what will happen to have a realistic novel. Now, the invention of this future, which is rationalized as appearing in philosophy, is directed, linked to the progress of Europe imperialistically, to the mapping of Earth and rejection of other concepts of ontological time, which is replaced by historic time, which has a past, where you can tell about a present now, and a future will be one's past using statistics. Interested physiocrats are looking at farming. They're trying to conceive how they can rationalize cultures and harvest to predict the yields. How are you going to use data on the latest seasons to predict the way in which you will harvest and collect a quantity of goods from Earth? This past is a kind of backdrop of what is referred to in the 19th century as sci-fi, as being sci-fi, which will be called anticipation, rational anticipation, speculation, rational speculation, sci-fi, in a narrow sense of the term, as built by Yoga Gernbach in the 20s. Now, the idea is that sci-fi is no longer prediction or prophecy, but it becomes that type of narrative which is rational, pretend to be based on scientific data, making it possible using statistical tools, projective tool, and with the help of imagination to produce ahead of time a history of the future. European sci-fi at the time is simply a byproduct of history. We're producing history of the past, and sci-fi becomes a byproduct of the history which was not yet established. We can try to deduce and project into by imagination. Now, to wrap up, let me try to go backtrack and the idea of Wells and Scientist 913, the prediction, the idea of sci-fi in Europe as it was born in the 18th century. In the first case, the idea is that sci-fi in Wells' idea is derived from religious prophecies. He's a scientist. He says humanity is progressing. It will drop religions after World War I. And what Wells thinks that prophecy is a kind of imagination born in religions, which is destined to become a lay and to rationalized based on scientific data. Sci-fi is that the prophecy is becoming a lay, predicting the future from data which are based upon, by reading of theories based upon Wells is interested in the emergence of nuclear physics to produce a history of nuclear energy. In Wells' idea, sci-fi deals with reality, not possibility. Well, as he says, trying to reincorporate reality, future into reality, trying to be a realist as to the future. In sci-fi, the spirit of sci-fi in the 18th century, in the theories of studies in the Enlightenment period, sci-fi is designed, conceived, not is possible as a project the possible, which is not before in the past or elsewhere in another place, but in the future. Future becomes the place, the locale, which could welcome the possible. The issue of the second conception, which you are a prisoner of, which is the narrow conception of sci-fi, the problem is as follows: it will tend to partition forms of projection of the possible into the future. Why? Because what was born in the 18th century is a kind of idea according to which basically future is the last place available in a rationalist world. In a rational world, through science and techniques, future is the last place where you can project possibilities. You cannot project possibilities into space, because space is known. It's a place of knowledge. We know space, we map it. Likewise, we map the Earth, we can map the solar system beyond. You cannot project possible into space. Space is reality, actuality. You cannot project possible in the past because the idea is such that you have a theory of story, of history. The myth is rejected and goes back to primitive beliefs, the idea according to which, because we ignore the past, we would fantasize about something which would happen before. It will be rejected by this rational form of projection. By default, sci-fi will appear as a kind of leisure for human species. When you look at the possibility, it will be the only place where you can try to study the possible. If you do sci-fi like a scientist, you study forms of possibilities, what is possible scientifically, namely possibilities in terms of matter, in terms of techniques, in terms of technology, but also in terms of anthropology, new kinds of social forms. All this is reserved to the future, so that it would seem that if you look back, it's a conception defending the fact that both the future is a place which is possible. It should never be the only one, because if it's the only one place, you have a conception of sci-fi which is like a tool for compensating our inability to project. It's a sad form of sci-fi, which is a refuge. You got to take refuge in sci-fi to try to imagine recombination, political possibilities, because we're not able to do this in the present. You're not able to invest in the past, trying to have history, or trying to emerge, have possibilities emerge, or trying to have possibilities emerge elsewhere in other places, in other states. The only conception of sci-fi which is tenable is one in which you recognize that the future is a locale, a place among others to project possible, like the past is, like the present, like elsewhere. It's a concept which is narrow of sci-fi, which you inherited from the 18th century, which confine sci-fi to the future, the only place to project the possible. The future as such, like Wells, should remain the future, because if it's a past, the problem of a future will become present. By becoming present, sci-fi is losing successful sci-fi is losing its power. That's destiny of Wells' book. It becomes a poor, ill-gotten, wrong literature if you can design or conceive the future as a place for projecting. If you anticipate this, the paradox which is found is that sci-fi, when it is successful, it's a failure because it can, when successful through knowledge of the possible, produce by anticipation the history of the future, but its future is only something which is past, and it becomes poor realistic literature. The problem is how to try to maintain the future as a territory among others, to project the possible and to think sci-fi not as a representation in advance of reality of the future, which is a past, but the infiltration, localization of the possible into the future, not only the future. Let me wrap up on this. If you know sci-fi, the terrain is broader. Sci-fi is grabbing the past and the future, trying to look for possibilities, trying to fight against the idea according to which the past is necessary, what was is. Lucrone, Charles Renouvier is building Lucrone from his writings or readings of Pascal. You know, if the nose of Cleopatra had been shorter, the face of the world would have changed, using, namely, the idea of counterfactual. The nose of Cleopatra had it been shorter, and to produce another past. And from the standpoint of the past, also, like the future, is terrain for fiction, for fighting, where sci-fi will debate the idea according to which past will be reality. All that is past cannot have been something that's rejected possible in the past. A lot of historians are using this, it could be a tool for imagination to think that it could have been different. Let me give another example from this. The fact that when colonization started and you had the first theoreticians against the Spaniards, Las Casas, who became the first governor of Argentina, when he starts to understand there's a necessity, a fatality, trying to oppose destruction of native peoples, killed by his own men. He's strangled by his own men because he's trying to pass a law to protect the indigenous people. They would produce in their letters forms, fictional forms, which are counterfactual, trying to persuade that it could have been different. They are the first to propose narratives in which, for example, they're telling to their correspondents, let's imagine the time Africans might have conquered Europe, for example, or America. And they call upon the imagination, producing sci-fi, reinfiltrating the possible into historical necessity, which is so heavy they cannot be otherwise. That's the way it's fatal. It's a foregone conclusion. You need 10 slaves in Hispaniola, and the sugar cane plants need more slaves. Based on necessity, the first anti-colonials will use sci-fi, will turn the past. They're trying in the past to introduce something which is different. Let me wrap up on this. Sci-fi, in the broadest sense of the term, is any kind of fictional tool trying to relocate, finding a place for the possible, infiltrating possible into the necessary in the past, in the present, or in the future, or elsewhere. Thank you again. And I'm going to stop right here.
Merci beaucoup, Tristan Garcia pour cette...
Thank you, Tristan Garcia, for this wonderful presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience? On the contentions of science fiction. I can only recommend the fantastic text written by Wells in the original, that you can find online, actually. Question. Thank you for your fascinating presentation, which is quite thought-provoking, and in particular on the social relevance of science fiction, in the sense that it is a way of narrating the future. In your intervention, what we saw is the great diversity of possible narrations of what might happen. You gave us a kind of historiography, and the question I ask myself is whether we can say today, in the 21st century, there's an unbalance in the expression between the different narrations. For example, there's an importance of myth in our society. Utopia is something that is less structuring than myth. And because of that science fiction, as a way of thinking about possible futures, is something that takes on more importance. Can we think along those lines and think about a balance to be found between the different narrations of a possible future? Well, we have to have a literary genre of narrations, but I'm not sure it's true. For a long time, I thought there was a closeness, a camaraderie, but also a rivalry between the two. Can we think about Scientology and science fiction? There are times, there were times, namely after the war in the 40s, between 45 and 55, there's a great predominance of narration over science fiction. The Asimov and Line, Van Vogt, they had doubts about the future, so they imagined what might be in. Before there was the Lord of the Rings published, narration was marginalized and science fiction was marginalized. In the counterculture in the 60s and 70s, there's a kind of renewal of fantasy writing. And very clearly, one could say that in the year, or as of the year 2000, there was a decline in science fiction in a reduced way. And you would go to any bookstore, and when I was a kid, fantasy was at the end of science fiction. As of the year 2000 was Harry Potter and many other bestsellers or mainstream things, books like Susanna Clarke's, Jonathan Lerner and others. They were bestsellers and they were widely read. So you had a fantasy section, and science fiction was at the bottom of that section, or the back of the section, or almost under the table. So it was not predominant. If you think that science fiction or fantasy writing was a genre unto itself, from fantastic writing of Victorian times, it was grew out as a rebellion against Victorian times. So there were fairies and a pre-industrial world, a pre-capitalist world, and there was a world that was also a very Christian world. So for a long time, there was a grade for reading that, fantasy being more reactionary, which is a way of turning back to the past and not looking into the future, and just using forms of the past, saving them and reusing them, and reproducing the past for a long time. And and you would find this in Marxist theorists. There was a concrete representation of the future in science fiction, and the fantasy writing was more warlike, or something of the past, or feudal. Many people who thought about it questioned the fact in the year 2000 there was a prejudice about genre, and fantasy was more feminine and science fiction more masculine. So there was a disparaging attitude towards fantasy rather than towards science fiction. But how things might have changed in the past 10 years. There is emerging flora mentioned Jemisin, and we don't know whether these are authors of fantastic writing or Scientology, so it's a moot point. There was a reunification of anything non-fictional in which there's a common ground of something imaginary, which it's fantastic writing or science fiction. Then there is a reshuffling of the cards. And Flora, you managed M.K. Jemisin getting the Hugo Award, and the latest ones to get the award, the Hugo Award, were female authors. Anyway, so there is a feminization of science fiction, which wasn't the case 15 or 20 years ago, and all of the effects of this reshuffling the cards mean that there's no clear distinction between fantasy and science fiction. When I talk about science fiction, broadly speaking, in my opinion, this includes fantastic writings. These are narrative forms, but not only. We mustn't exclude illustrators from that category. So there are forms of representations of the future or projections of what might be possible, whether in the past, in the future, in the present, or elsewhere. And we can create categories of this genre, but I would say that there is the emergence of a unified field of all of these types of writing. With this in mind, I think that it would be very difficult for me to create a diagnosis. For example, in the year 2000, there were lamentations as to the fact that we couldn't represent ourselves as any kind of future. And readers of science fiction in the years 2000, there was a renewal of space opera like Peter Hamilton or Wilson. These were authors that resuscitated the space war of the 50s, but it wasn't anything new. At the time, there's no science fiction in the years 2000, even in the cinema. There is nothing else but re-editions of Star Wars. Whereas today, I think things are different. Against the backdrop of anything imaginary correlate to fears, I would even go further than I would say that for better or for worse, science fiction as a political tool is shared amongst all. Sci-fi, and this is very noticeable in Europe. We have an imaginary of science fiction. The great case of the total replacement, the total reshuffle. These are two forms of possible that are colonial inversions. For example, colonial inversion is a form that was coined in a book that many of you have probably not read, which is not a bestseller, but one that was very much read online. The book by Jean Moulin describing the colonization of France by immigrants coming to Europe. And this contributed a lot to imaginary writing and fictional writing in the past few years. This shows that the science fiction imagination is used by all camps and by all political realms. So science fiction has become a new possibility for imagining all things, and and everywhere, by all groups, by all camps. And it's not necessarily used by any political groups that think about political emancipation. It can be based on fear of climate change, fear of reverse colonization. But for example, at the end of the war in Algeria, there were many authors, Pieds Noirs in origins, French colonizers, after 1962, after the independence of Algeria. These writers imagine Algerians colonizing France. Of course, it's science fiction. It uses the tools of an version of the reality. So this is a long answer to your question, but I think science fiction has become a very powerful tool. Imagining the future is used by all political groups, and it's very present today. Thank you. Virginie Tourdet will tell us more about the Red Team project in her presentation tomorrow. Virginie is a science fiction writer who works with the government for a project called Red Team, imagining possible futures and possible threats in the future. So she'll tell us more about it tomorrow. Yes, I will tell you more about the project tomorrow. This is a project launched by the agency called Initiative Défense, imagining the types of threats that we might be faced with in the next 40 years. Of course, this is to respond to what was said today and to make a presentation that is correct according to the epistemology. Any other questions? We can still take one or two. We can take questions if they're answered briefly and brilliantly, says Martin. We'll have plenty of time over our coffee break, and let us applaud Tristan Garcia once again. Thank you very much.